Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to tonight's Communities Committee meeting. Just my few words of introduction first. This is a public meeting and members of the public and press are permitted to report on the proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photography, making an audio recording and providing commentary on proceedings. Please note this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant meeting page of the Council's website. By choosing to attend this public meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting personal belongings. All escape routes are clearly signed. Once you've left the building, the assembly point is on the High Street opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphone when speaking. Okay. Item 1 on the agenda, appointment of substitutes.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We do have one substitute this evening. Louise Griffiths is here for Stephen Hodgson.
Thank you. Item 2, declarations of interest. Do I have any? No, thank you. Public participation? Thank you. Item 4, the minutes of the meeting held on the 26th of May. I'm just proposing to go through them by page and I'll pause at the end, and should anybody wish to raise queries or points, the opportunity will be there. Page 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Anything anyone wishes to raise? Okay, thanks very much. Item 5 on the agenda, Museums Worcestershire Annual Review. We're delighted to welcome Philippa to the meeting this evening, and well, in your own time, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. For those members who are not familiar with Museums Worcestershire, it's a joint service for the City Council and the County Council, and it's overseen by a joint committee made up of 2 city members and 2 county members, and we feed into this committee at the city, feed into the Communities Committee, although I often also report into Place and Economic Development because we sort of fit between the two in the sort of work that we do. Museums produces an annual report which gives us that opportunity to look backwards over the work that we've achieved over the last 12 months. Obviously this year has not been a usual year. It's been challenging and been difficult for many of us, but it's also been a time when our communities have really needed us the most. I think that museums do something quite special and unique. They bring a level of quality of life to people who visit and to the people they work with. And so really it was a good opportunity for us to quite change what it was that we needed to do, because our front doors weren't open, but we still needed to do the good work that we do. So it's an interesting annual report to talk through. I'm going to talk you through the highlights that are probably most of interest to this committee, but I'm very happy to answer any questions or go through any detail that might come out of the rest of it. So with your permission, everybody, I'd like to start on page 11 of the pack, which is the report page headed Our Museums. It's got a lovely picture of our staff member with their thumbs up on it. So first of all, I want to sort of talk to you about how well we did manage to open when we were open. So I'm actually very proud that we managed to open for the maximum legally allowed number of days that museums were allowed to open this year. So that was less than 5 months of the 12 months of the year, but we did significantly better than most museums did for being able to do that. There are 50 museums that are directly funded by the central government, and it's very easy to get the data on them. And of those 50 museums, only 27 were able to open at all in 2020. So I think we did pretty well of being able to open where we did. We had an average returning visitorship of 48% when we were open, 48% of a normal year. And as again, this was higher than national museums. National museums were averaging 18%. And I think it really was reflecting the fact that people were enjoying that opportunity to support their local local attractions on their doorstep, and frankly, by last summer, really, many people were very eager to be able to get out and do things, quality things with their family again. I do think it is worth noting, although this is looking back, I do want to let you know that actually, again, we're doing well since we've been able to reopen in May, and our numbers are higher again this year. I think that's, again, better than museums are doing nationally. I've got more data on returning people if anybody would be interested in hearing about it as we go on. I think it's an interesting sign that maybe Worcester hasn't been as affected as badly as some other places have, or maybe that Worcester is feeling like very positive about being able to go back to normal and the safeness of the spaces that we offer. So then I'm going to move on to page 17 of the report, which specifically talks about the work that we do with our communities. One of the things I'm very pleased that we were able to achieve this year was really bringing quite a significant amount of external funding, and not just use it to help the museums, but to use it to help our communities in their widest sense. So both the Arts Council and Historic England had emergency funds at the very beginning of the pandemic, and we were able to bring in money from both of those that we then used to support our local creative and our local heritage communities in quite practical ways. So this was things like commissioning, small commissions for local artists so that they were really able to continue to work and to create and to be paid for it, most importantly. And also Worcestershire has an excellent small heritage community, lots of small organisations that do great work, many of which are volunteer run, running our small history societies, small museums across the county, and most of them were hit really hard. They were run by people that were not used to having to deal with things like risk assessments and all of those things that the government guidance forced people to do. And we were able to support them with practical stuff like, how do you do this? Here's a bit of information about how you can work with volunteers and produce the right risk assessments for them so that they keep them safe as they do their work. So I do think both of those were really important things to do to carry on. One of the things that work we did with the Historic England funding was it did quite a lot of surveying of Worcestershire heritage organisations, and that was fed back to Historic England to try and inform how they ought to be thinking about their grants for upcoming years. And I think that's also really important. We're a very typical county actually in Worcestershire, and that's very useful that we feed that information back into public policy in the longer term, particularly when it comes to where funding might come from. Our own volunteers, like many across the country and many different organisations, not just museums, were suddenly stopped from being able to contribute, and we know that their well-being suffered. We've just recently instigated a form of evaluation that does some fairly robust well-being evaluation to work out where people's sense of their positive or their negative thoughts are going, and we were able therefore to track a 32% decrease in their well-being when lockdown started, which is obviously a significant concern for many people for whom coming in and working in the museums on a weekly or something basis is, very much one of the things that they look forward to every week, and perhaps that may be the main thing they look forward to every week. So we created a project that enabled those volunteers to contribute from home. It trained them to use technology when that was needed. It provided them with technology when that was needed, and also put together an infrastructure that enabled museum artifacts to safely travel out into volunteers' homes. Now, I have to say this is very unusual in museums. We tend to be very careful of our artifacts to make sure that they're not damaged. Obviously, we keep them in trust for future generations, and that can sometimes be a barrier to making sure that people can participate in ways like this. And so what we've done is really quite groundbreaking in finding ways that museums volunteers can work outside of the sites themselves, and it's been set up as a national structure that others can use, and it's being followed certainly by the London Archives, and we're hoping by other museums and archives as the year goes on. Our learning team really had to completely change the way they work. Our learning team most usually work on our sites with both families and with schools or formal learning education groups. And really none of that was possible, or not in the same ways. So we were very pleased to be able to get some funding from the DCMS's Culture Recovery Fund, which enabled us to do quite a bit of testing and experimentation, because really we were working in an area that we didn't know how to do, truthfully, at this point. We needed to find the ways to do it. And so we were able to do work initially online. Quite a lot of it was able to transition online, first with very simple things, but then getting more sophisticated as time went on. And we used both our website, but also significantly use of social media, which is tends to be a little bit more accessible to a wider number of people. And then actually, by the time we got through the year as a whole, we really became masters in how to do sessions by Zoom. So we were working with schools by Zoom, with into care homes by Zoom, with looked after children and their families, and with home educators. We were really managing to do this all virtually. It's an interesting thing because museums are very much about the real and experiencing the real items of history, and doing that, holding something up to a screen feels like it wouldn't work, but actually we became quite experts at finding ways to do that. And I was particularly pleased that we could work with people living with dementia in these ways, and they still gained a great deal about those ideas of reminiscence that we were working with. I particularly want to pay tribute to the museum team, who really were incredibly willing to make everything work and find new ways of working in the most extraordinary circumstances. As well as being able to keep the museums going, we also supported quite several other essential services across the city, and we assisted with the social isolation payments and the business grants, and indeed we're now going back to new social isolation grant payments again now that we're working with. So. And then I think I'd like to flag up the pandemic collecting project, because I think one of the most important things is that we retain a sense of this for the future. I don't know about all of you, but I think even just looking back a year, it's felt like the things that we have thought about the pandemic have changed significantly over that time. And recording some of those initial feelings and fears are really quite an important cathartic way that people can work with museums in the long term. It's interesting, at the beginning we looked to see whether we had anything that related to the 1918 flu pandemic, and actually there was nothing in the museum's collections about that. There was one thing in the Worcestershire Archives collections, and I think we want to do something different this time to make sure that there is that recording for future history to be able to look back to. And it's interesting, we're really starting to just bring those things physically into the museum now, and some of the conversations we're having with those donors are particularly interesting to give a sense of how they remember that period a year ago. And then finally, I just want to look forward a little bit. It's been a year that's taught us a great deal in museums. I think we need to learn new ways of working, but actually I think we've probably made significant strides forward in the ways that we would like to be working in the future. We've got much better infrastructure to be able to work digitally. Our networks have grown much deeper into our communities. We've got actual evidence of the difference we've made to people's well-being through the work that we've done. And that, I think this is starting to come into the next stage of the work that we do, because we've been commissioned this summer to run the programme of activities for free school meals at the commandery. So it's lovely that kind of is feeding back into some active work over this summer. And there's also museums and heritage development included in the city's Towns Fund plans, which will improve what we can offer at both of the museums. Does anyone have any particular questions they'd like to ask me?
I've got Matt Lamb.
Okay, thanks very much for that presentation. I really enjoyed that. And, you know, Worcester Art Gallery and Museum is one of my favourite places in the city. And this year, I really enjoyed the printed line exhibition and the Titanic exhibition. I thought those were great. And, you know, myself, like a lot of people, you know, there's increasingly we're staycationing, aren't we? You know, we're increasingly where, rather than jetting off overseas, we're discovering our own country. And, you know, you go to various cities in the UK, as I've been doing over the last few weeks and months, and the small art galleries are a key attraction of any city. I was in Bury St Edmunds about 2 weeks ago and visited their art gallery. I'm going to the M Shed in Bristol next week. And, you know, our sort of collection of art galleries is the match of any I've seen. But in a way, I think we could even do more. And I know for a fact that we've got all these art treasures which are hidden away. And it's interesting talking about the, you know, the city's Japanese collection, which I think is going to be really great. It just goes to show that it seems for every kind of form of art, every genre and every style, we've got something hidden away. And therefore you think when you go to the art gallery and museum, you know, the actual space available to display is actually relatively limited. And I think it's been raised before, that we're missing a trick. When, if you bear in mind the bottom of the museum and art gallery, which used to be the old library, you know, it's now used for obviously council offices. And I'm wondering whether, you know, some of that bottom space could be used to display an even larger selection of the city's art. You know, I think we're missing a trick there because it's a wonderful building, and I know council officers have got to go somewhere clearly, but to use that wonderful space for offices, whereas it could be used for displaying an even wider range of artworks, I think we're missing a little bit of a trick there.
Well, I completely agree that we have a fantastic collection. I mean, Worcester should be incredibly proud of the collection we have. And I think I've included in the report that we are the 6th oldest museum service in the country, which is really something to celebrate. And I think partly because of that age, we are very various. There is an awful lot of things in our collection. And I think some of the criticism that you could say of our service at the moment is that we tend to be a little bit unfocused. And that is definitely in our strategic planning for the way forward, to try and increase our focus, become better well known for what we are really good at. But that doesn't mean that we should stop doing these extra things that enable the maximum use of the collections. I think the full art gallery museum building is a really interesting question, an interesting position. And obviously with the position over the pandemic where we've needed to all work from home, it's meant that the city has needed to look at what position of their offices is. We're a long way from making any final decisions on that. And obviously we're never going to be in a position where that it would be appropriate to create a museum and art gallery that wouldn't be a positive contribution to the funding to do that. But I would say that it's certainly something that is being thought through, what options there might be for the future.
Okay, Lynn Denham.
Yes, thank you. And well done. And that's the main thing I wanted to say. I mean, there are very few apparent positives from the pandemic, but I think the kind of creativity and innovation of some organisations like yourselves in actually doing things differently, and it feels actually that there's been a kind of a step change in community involvement by the museums out into the city, and to be, you know, very inclusive in all sorts of ways, in terms of the kind of cultural diversity of the community of our city, and sort of engaging in that, the diversity of the collections. So yeah, well done. And to be providing the part of the summer free school meals program is, you know, a really interesting example of that. And I understand that the current exhibition has been specifically designed to be dementia friendly. And I think, you know, the relationship with the Worcester Life Stories and that project actually illustrates the kind of Worcester diaspora, people that used to live in Worcester and that, you know, are still interested to engage in the history of the city in a very positive way. So yeah, well done and thank you.
Thank you. I've got Jim Carver and then Tom Collins.
Just a very quick one. Just again, you know, well done, and it obviously exciting times as we move forward, as things hopefully start opening up, return to normal. Really wanted to talk about the Bardo project and see how things have developed following the recent appointment.
Anna, that's a really interesting question. So yeah, so for members that don't know, we the county museum, so this is not a city collection, but this is obviously part of the joint service. The county service has nationally the best collection of gypsy bardos. Gypsy bardos are the name for the beautifully decorated caravans that traditionally gypsies travelled in, and traditionally they were burned after gypsies' family had finished with them, I suppose, at a significant death in the family, and so they were unusual to have kept in museums, and we're very lucky with the very impressive collection that we have. But what the county doesn't have a great deal of is it doesn't have a great deal of contextual information. So a lot of the research about the gypsy families that owned the decorated bardos that we have is held at the University of Liverpool and at the University of Reading and other significant archives across the country, and also, truthfully, in people's memories. And so that's the work that we intend to do over the next couple of years. We've had funding from the Ellerman Foundation to really start to join those up so that it becomes to some extent writing an unwritten history. We are only at the very beginning of that. We recently appointed a project officer just a couple of months ago. I would say she is a very impressive young woman who has herself a background with the Gypsy Roman community. So she's in a position where she can make that bridge, I think, between academia and the community and create a level of trust of information there. And the intention is that over long term we can create an exhibition and displays at the County Museum that does justice to a very important but quite difficult to interpret part of this area's history.
Yeah, if you've never been, it's worth looking, no matter what you know. If you've got a sort of background such as mine, my grandmother was born in Avado, or if your background, say like Councillor Amos, you know, he's a carpenter. Do you have a look at the quality of the woodworking there? It really is worth a visit, and to say it's a nationally significant collection, I think is an understatement. It really is something very, very special, and hopefully as things develop, it's something I'll be keen to work with and see if we can take that forward. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Tom Collins.
Thank you. I am frankly staggered. Museums and galleries are kind of the symbol of the stable, and it would have been so easy for people to anticipate that this kind of sudden crisis and disruption would just cause you to go into stasis or collapse. And yet, this seems like we've just had described to us the gold standard in crisis response. You've so quickly oriented to the situation around you, how it's impacting your customers and your operation. You've fallen back on your values and your purpose and worked out how you continue to deliver that in a new way. We've gone beyond just responding to innovating and setting new standards that have now been deployed nationally. And then even in the context of all of that, you've fallen back onto the front foot and gone, but we need to record this and document this for the future. It's absolutely mind-blowingly brilliant, and I'm so proud to be associated with this in any way. Thank you and well done.
Thank you. I really do very much appreciate it, and I will pass it on to the team, who have been incredibly hardworking over this year and deserve absolutely everything you've just said.
Thank you. Mike, do you want to speak?
It's outside of our brief, but I'd be interested to know how Hartfordbury survived, because clearly the trust, I guess, really struggled, and our county bit. And the other question, which I think is in the public domain, but here you go. What, if anything's happening about the military museums?
Okay, first questions first. So the County Museum at Hartfordbury. So for members who wouldn't necessarily know, it's run in partnership between Worcestershire County Council and Hartfordbury Castle Preservation Trust, who is a charitable trust, a relatively small charitable trust, who rescued the site when the Church Commissioners decided to sell it. So yes, it was difficult for them as a small charity. You are completely correct. As you can imagine, they found it quite hard. They were able to access a fair bit of emergency funding, and I'm very pleased to say they were very successful in doing so. But they did have a period where they needed to shut down part of the site and make their staff redundant for a short period, although I'm really pleased to say that they've hired them all back again now, which is a very positive position to be in. Actually, our numbers are back to 93% of where they were on a normal day now in Hartfordbury, which is very good news. The real advantage of Hartfordbury is that it has so much outdoor space. And I think that at a time when we still know that a good proportion of our audience are finding, are worried about catching COVID, I can't blame them for that, and are therefore not necessarily wanting to make indoor visits, and outdoor space feels even safer. Despite all the hard work we've done to make the indoor spaces safe, an outdoor space feels even safer. So I am confident, particularly with, as we've talked about already, the staycation audience over the summer holidays. I'm confident that we're bouncing back at Hartfordbury very much so. Yes, your second question, which I've immediately thought it was. Sorry, say that again. Oh, the military museum. Yeah, yes. So the position is that this was included within the Worcester's Town Fund application. Many members will be aware of the position that we're in with Towns Fund application, that there's a bit of preparatory work that's underway at the moment, and that it goes to the P&R committee in September, I believe, to sign off the new allocations. At this point, the intention is that we are able to continue with the excellent preparatory work that we've done to move the Worcestershire Soldier to the Commandery, which will be a better home for it and will give additional interest for the commandery space, I think. And certainly a lot of the preparatory work is underway. Obviously, that is not confirmed with the funding from the Towns Fund until we go through the P&R position. But having said that, if that doesn't happen from the Towns Fund, there are other avenues that we will be able to explore. That is my aim, that we probably over the next 3 or 4 years, we move that and modernise that display and take it down to the commandery where it has a new life.
Just one question that I was going to approach it in a kind of, I guess, Worcester-centric sense, but probably on the Councillor Carver's question about working widely across the country and getting either artifacts or information or whatever from other parts of the country. To what extent are we succeeding in, and to what extent can we improve on collaboration within the museum service? I mean, as I say, essentially, I was thinking Worcester, but perhaps the more interesting question is how we can develop that across the country, because we live in a pretty transient time. People are moving to different parts of the country, but still would be drawn to an exhibit or a presentation that reminded them of their family's history, which may be in another part of the country. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that particularly.
I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because Worcester particularly, I think, is one of those places that often you can leave when you're young, and then maybe you come back and you settle when you have your kids and you're there for longer. And I think your mention of a diaspora of Worcestershire people out there is completely correct. One of the things that Cultural Recovery Fund this year enabled us to do was to increase our marketing out to a wider range. So whereas normally we focus, I mean, money-wise, truthfully, we focus on our kind of immediate locality, the Worcestershire area. We've been able to throw additional funding at it this year and push that across the Black Country and into the urban conurbation of Birmingham. And I do think that that's proven itself in the fact that we've been getting so many people coming to the current Titanic exhibition. It really goes to show, if you have an exhibition that is universally appealing, which is something that we're really trying very hard to do, but still with a Worcestershire story behind it. So it gives it a strength to our own local residents too, that it has that wider appeal that we can connect to. We work quite closely with both Visit Worcester and Visit Worcestershire, neither of which are very highly funded. If you compare them to cities like York or something that have incredibly well-funded destination management organisations, they do a lot of that work for their local attractions. They're pushing tourists to come to the city. And that's something that we're not in a position to be able to yet do in this area, although it would be something I'd love to see further work done as time goes on. But I do think the more that we can do, it becomes easier with social media, but it's definitely something that needs continuous work to make sure that we're just reminding people how great Worcester is as a place to come and visit.
Good, thank you. Any other further points before we move on? Okay, I mean, the recommendation is that we note the contents of the report. I assume everyone's happy to do that. Yeah. Okay, and I'd just like to thank you for your time, Philippa, and wish you well for the coming year. Thank you. Moving on to item 6 on the agenda, Worcestershire Housing First Contract Update. Pass to Lloyd, and we have a guest as well, Lloyd.
Thank you, Chair. And there's always a risk of following such a good warmer back, so I'll try my very best. Thank you. Just to give Jonathan a little bit of time to gather his thoughts and Julian to load the slides, I will very briefly introduce the report, Chair. It's a noting report and intends to update members on how the Housing First contract has gone since its inauguration in February 2020. Members will be aware that the service is contracted to St Paul's, and Worcester City is the lead authority on behalf of all 6 districts and the County Council. Paragraph 2.6 outlines some of the key partners that are providing the accommodation for us. The service costs are circa £250,000 per year, and up until March 23, that will be funded through government funding. And health and social care business rate extension pilot funding, and obviously contributions from districts themselves. And there was an additional sum of money approved by this committee earlier 2018 again towards a contribution towards Housing First units. Importantly, and again very welcome, the scheme is additionally supported by St Paul's through charitable funding, and that's very much focused around personalised budget support for individual rough sleepers. The service is supporting 34 rough sleepers, targets those most difficult to accommodate, and 3.1 outlines the numbers per district. There's also a table in 3.1 as to the types of accommodation that rough sleepers are residing in. It's a service that mirrors very much traditional Housing First principles, but Jonathan will talk more about that in a moment. Paragraph 3.3 just shows the type and level of support that we're providing rough sleepers and the range of that support. And importantly, 3.4 gives you a figure there of 100% success rate in supporting participants to maintain their tenancy. So that's, you know, we're not getting carried away with ourselves, but it's a really good start, and we're looking to build on that. Importantly, from a learning point of view, there's also an evaluation element to this project being supported by the University of Worcester, and that would be a critical piece of work for us to carry out, to learn from, and then to influence. So that's probably enough from me, Chair. I'm happy to hand over to Jonathan to take us through the rest of the item.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, Jonathan Sutton, to the meeting. Most of you, in fact, I suspect all of you will have met Jonathan at some point. So, in your own time, Jonathan.
Thank you, Councillor. First of all, may I say, while St Paul's are proud to deliver the support element to this, the housing associations who are providing the accommodation, the local authority points of contact, and I must mention Catherine Jones of this parish, who stitched this all together brilliantly. It's a team effort, and I think gold standard really in how to collaborate to deliver a service that is really working. I'm going to show you a short video in a second. It's only 3 minutes, and it explains Housing First much better than I can do that. I will just make one point. There is an international and significant evidence base that underpins this approach, and that is why Crisis, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others are asking the government to roll out Housing First at scale. It's because if it's done to a high fidelity model, which adheres strongly to the principles, then the success rate is around 80%. So that's the reason why. Would it be possible, please, to try the video?
Sector. It uses housing as a starting point rather than an endpoint outcome. In other words, it uses housing as an instrument of reintegration rather than a result of a long reintegration process. It enables homeless people with challenging support needs because of their mental health problems to stay in their homes. Housing First is probably the most important innovation in homeless service design that has been in the last 30 years. Developed in North America by Sandy Separate, based on earlier service models, working with people with mental health problems. We've seen it spread across Europe, and despite all these different contexts, what Housing First enables us to do is to really get to a point where we can, for most people with complex, solve their homes.
There is a worry that Housing First is moving people, very vulnerable people, housing and leaving them to go on their own. Some people think that homeless people with high support cannot be housed, and some others think that Housing First is very safe. These are some of the misconceptions that are addressed in the Bible.
Whatever program calls itself Housing First must have access, immediate access, meaning, within a few weeks to real housing. Not a shelter, not something shared, not transitional, a place of their own, permanent, furnished. The person person can have a sense of ownership about, and they pay some percentage of the money they have, if they have money, towards the rent, usually 30%, something like that. But it's real housing, usually integrated into the community. If that's what the person wants, if the person wants something else, then it's the housing that the person wants, not that the program prescribes. The other part of the program is the support services, and the support services need to be at a level of intensity that is prepared to meet the needs of the person. So if you're housing people with severe mental illness or health problems or addiction problems or all kinds of other problems, you should have on your team the ability either to provide those directly, like in an ACT team, or to broker for them local community clinics or other kind of based services. You're the broker of services.
Housing First Services successfully house approximately 8 out of every 10 homeless people with high support. Although positive effects were not uniform, projects have reported stabilization and reduction in drug and alcohol, improvement in mental health, improvement in physical health, and social integration can happen in the day. Housing First has also the potential to reduce costs for other services.
Yeah, I hope everyone did. It was just okay.
Model which takes someone from the street, perhaps put in a shelter, perhaps then a hostel, and then some form of resettlement accommodation or private rented. And at every stage, there are obligations to move on. It's often called the staircase model. Housing First removes the steps in between and takes someone from a position where often rough sleeping or sofa surfing has been the dominant form of homelessness, straight into a house of their choice. And that's the difference. It isn't required for everybody. It doesn't need to be provided for everybody. But the key difference is there are no steps in between. The key consequence of that approach is that the case managers have to be very well qualified, very grounded, very emotionally aware adults in order to deal with the emotional dysregulation and difficulties and risks that the participants in Housing First will show, will behave. The point I wish you please to take away is that there is often talk and misunderstanding between the term Housing First and Housing Led. The key point about Housing First is its adherence to those principles which are outlined in your paper. And the further away from those principles which it drifts, the more like a floating support service that Housing First becomes. So it's adherence to the principles. And part of the evaluation by the university is to evaluate how close to those principles the service remained. Those principles are important because there are tensions, and I just want to explain those. The first principle is people have the right to a home. Of course, there are never enough affordable accommodation vacancies in this city, or indeed some places in the county, for that to take place. And therein lies a tension between the hard-pressed and hard-working housing officers who wish to move people and discharge their legislative duty, and the Housing First case manager who will be advocating on behalf of the participant to say, yes, but they don't want to live there because, so can we please wait? So that's a tension. The other tension is a harm reduction approach. Moving people into accommodation doesn't mean that they give up addictions. It doesn't mean that they will give up heroin. So the case manager needs to be alive to those risks and operate a risk reduction approach, which means not stopping someone doing these things, but making sure that there's a plan in place to keep them and others safe. Again, it refers back to the importance of very good workers to do this work. The 80% success rate you saw in the video, the success rate so far, nobody in accommodation in this service has returned to rough sleeping. And to give you a sense of the type of person that have been transferred to Housing First service, most of the individuals you will have seen in the Worcester News on numerous occasions for antisocial behaviour, behaviour problems, court appearances, fighting with the police, and alike. One person has 86 custodial sentences, 109 convictions, and has spent 25 years in and out of prison, homelessness, temporary accommodation, sofa surfing, and rough sleeping. And that man has now held down his own tenancy for well in excess of 1 year. And he's been arrested only once since very early on in the process, where a neighbour made a complaint. But he's actually reintegrating really, really well. So there are some tensions between what housing authority state duties are and the principles of Housing First. And it's the adherence to those principles that's really, really important. Housing First isn't new to the UK. The government are currently piloting a £25 million programme of 3 pilots, West Midlands Combined Authority, Liverpool and Greater Manchester Authority. And those pilots are being run slightly differently to allow the government to assess how they might commission Housing First at scale. The important point to know is the evaluation of those services starts to emerge in early 2022. I think Manchester is first, followed by Liverpool, followed by Birmingham sometime in 2023. And it's really important that we track those, because the intention is, of course, that Worcestershire demonstrates it can do this and gets to the front of the queue in the inevitable competition for government funding. Next slide, if you would, please. You heard there is a myth about Housing First is expensive. Well, if you divide the number of participants by the annual bill, it's about £8,000 per year. And I would say expensive to what? Homelessness costs the state anywhere between £14,500 and £24,000 a year. A year in prison is £41,000. So I think the state picks up the bill somewhere. And I think the second important point for elected members to take away is the importance of this service towards a pooled funding model. The costs fall on not just housing, but they fall on prisons, they fall on the police, they fall on the criminal justice system, and they fall on health. And if you were able to influence, advise, support a continued pooled funding, it spreads the burden much better. I think it's unfair that housing always has to pick up the tab for what is in effect a problem that lands across the public realm. Next slide, please. So the intention then, plan A, is to look at those national evaluation pilots, use our own evaluation, which has been mirroring the methodology, to get Worcestershire to the front of the queue for that government funding, which we hope the Ministry of Housing will decide in 2022 or 2023. Like every good soldier will tell you, you need a plan B, and plan B would to share the burden within the county, this pooled funding model. At the moment, funding is coming from the business rates retention pilot, funded by County Council, with contributions from each of the 6 districts. My preference would be, I guess your preference would be, to try and get government funding for this rather than put more burden on the Worcestershire taxpayer. Next slide, please. Jeanette Sadler, the service leader, who I will pay tribute to, and her team to have pulled this off, the service started in February last year. So they were up against running on a new service in the teeth of a pandemic, which was no easy ask. The participants in the county display those types of characteristics. They, I guess, were on the housing list as people who were almost unhousable, for who the housing officers had difficulty finding solutions, and when a solution was found, it never lasted. We St Paul's did not have any decision about who was taken. We got on with taking who we were given from across the districts, and the workers made relationships with those participants and have worked hard to sustain them. So they're really, really difficult to house people. And it will come as no surprise to you that most of the difficult behaviour they demonstrate is often a result of relational damage from childhood and early life. And that's no surprise. There is a high association of adversity, ACEs, with the homeless community. Next slide, please. That slide just simply shows you some of the statistics. One of the problems that we have is trying to find a suitable accommodation place for someone against the backdrop of a shortage of affordable accommodation. And through the pandemic, we saw the housing associations have to slow things down. They couldn't get people to repair or turn over void properties. So it did slow things down enormously. Nevertheless, the majority now have been accommodated in a tenancy, not with a license, but with a proper tenancy agreement. And nobody has returned to rough sleeping after moving into accommodation, and that is better than the historical average for Housing First. Nearly there. I'll let you read about participant A. The other interesting benefit is if you would talk to the volunteers from the Worcester soup kitchens, they will tell you that the group of people that were most difficult at those settings who have been housed are not now turning up at the soup kitchens and causing antisocial behaviour and upsetting everybody else. And they will tell you that the impact has been demonstrable and noticeable. Last slide, I think. These are just photographs taken of some of the participants, and not all of these people are from Worcester, showing the accommodation that they have got into, showing that some of them are now going fishing at the Good Soil Project, buying bikes, returning from rehabilitation clinics, and starting to thrive. And it is a wonder to see, given the history of the participants hitherto. And I think we finish by some quotations or participant feedback. So I hope you have understood the economic benefits to the city of not having people sleeping rough, and the number of people that have been successfully rehoused in Housing First, adding to the point Philippa Tinsley made earlier about making this city even better. I think Housing First has done that and is doing that. I will be glad to take any questions you have. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Questions from the floor, please. Louise Griffiths, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that presentation. I think it's really amazing what you've done, and Jeanette in particular, who is lovely, and for her to have pulled this off in the middle of a pandemic is, I mean, it's nothing short of miraculous. I was already really impressed by the presentation and papers, but then to see the photographs at the end, and one gentleman on those in particular who I've come across on multiple occasions in town, who you and I have discussed on several occasions, to see him participating in this and being one of those people who's not returned to rough sleeping is staggering. And I think if other members in the room knew of him and had had interactions with him the way that I have, you would be absolutely astounded by the fact that he has maintained a tenancy, and not just that, but he's receiving rehabilitation within that tenancy. It's staggering. So I'm not as eloquent as Tom is when he's giving out all his praise, but you know, just it it's fantastic. It's a huge congratulations to you guys. And I really hope that this continues, because Housing First works. It works in the UK, it works in Europe, it works in the US. It's something that we need to look at more seriously, and we need to look at reducing homelessness and reducing rough sleeping outside of the context of it being a housing problem. It's a health issue, and it's something that can only be addressed once people have safe, secure housing. You know, this is the way forward with it. So I'm hoping that, you know, we can help get that funding from MHCLG, and if not, you know, hopefully the district councils and the county can come together to help continue funding this.
Okay, any further comment or questions? I mean, one thing that I sort of picked up on, and I don't necessarily know whether there's an answer as such to it, but in 3.3 on our sort of notes, as it were, when we look at the support received by participants, I was just curious as to whether or not the percentage of participants supported. I mean, the numbers vary quite a bit, and undoubtedly there's a reason for that. But whether or not, whether those figures roughly correlated to what people such as yourself, Jonathan, would have thought would have been the case before we began the process. Does that make sort of sense?
Sorry, Councillor, I didn't quite catch your point.
When we're looking at the data under 3.3, which is, you know, the support received by participants, it was the variety of the percentages that supported each item. And I was simply curious as to whether or not you feel, as someone, you know, very much, you know, on a day-to-day basis, you're thinking about these sort of things, whether that corresponded to what you thought might have been the case before the process began.
It is true to say that those practical things are difficult for some people to do and achieve, but for a variety of reasons. I think we also just need to be mindful that while practical things are important, often what the case managers will tell you is the emotional dysregulation that they have to try and moderate in order that a person can be calm and think and then undertake this type of work is more important. Because if they are in a fight, flight or freeze mode, brain responses that happens when people panic, then they can't engage the parts of the brain to do this work. And we are very careful about making sure those case managers are given more than adequate supervision, clinical supervision, access to their own well-being support, because otherwise it would make them ill, because it's a very, very tough task. They are part mum, they are part dad, they are some sort of para-health worker, they are parasocial worker, they are para-brother and sister. It's a multifaceted role that we are asking them to do. And I would urge you, I would encourage you to spend some time with those workers and go out and see what they do on a daily basis. Tough work. And they're not health professionals. They are housing workers with good history in this field. So I think that's to answer your question, Councillor, yes, that's normal. But before that, it's the emotional dysregulation, the calming, the soothing behaviours and the relationship building that's absolutely paramount to getting this right.
Thank you. Any further questions or comment? I've got Marjorie Bissett and Lynn Denham. Marjorie.
Okay. I noticed, I think this looks like a brilliant scheme as well. It's so obvious that by solving these problems, you actually save a lot of money on other problems. I noticed that one of the quotes was in terms of we, and I wonder if that reflects the fact that sometimes you house couples, and also whether some people have pets that they're very attached to, and can they keep their pets?
Yep, there are a couple of couples in the Housing First scheme. The partner isn't often counted because they're not officially on the scheme, but there are couples which make the numbers slightly higher than the briefing. And pets, absolutely. I think we all know the therapeutic value of an animal, often a dog, but not necessarily, could be a budgerigar, I guess, because they are non-judgmental, and people who have difficult historic relationships with human beings find remaking those relationships difficult, and a pet is a perfect companion. Indeed, participant A, who we talk about, he has now taken charge of a dog and spends most of his time and money looking after that dog, which is much better than what he was spending it on before. So that's a real success. He cherishes the dog and loves it. So it's what he needs. So yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Lynn?
Thank you. Yes, that's a really interesting description of both the theory and the practice and what's being delivered. And I think the table in 3.3 absolutely illustrates the scale of the problems and the difficulties of this sort of client group, if I can use that language, actually suffer from, and the absolute basis of actually accessing a GP, and any other sort of healthcare that flows from that. If you don't have a GP, you can't get many things. You can't get NHS care, basically. So I've got a question first, and then a couple of kind of reflections. So I hear what you said in terms of risk reduction with regard to dependencies and so on. Have people become clean? Is there actually a clean rate out of this as well?
I don't have that to hand. I can find out. If Jeanette were here, she would be able to tell you. If you'd let me come back with that figure. I know that at least one of the participants, I think possibly two, have been through a rehabilitation process and have remained substance-free from that process. That's at least one, I think two, both actually Worcester City participants. Would you be okay if I were to find that out? And I think in all honesty, it's a journey for people, and substance misuse changes over time when feelings of safety become stronger, and reasons to take these substances are dealt with.
Thank you. Yeah, and a couple of reflections. I mean, at the Safe Worcester meeting, I'm kind of looking at Warwick, but he is busy. But on that agenda, we have in the past frequently had homelessness as an antisocial behaviour issue. And I think this illustrates that it doesn't have to be, that isn't the right approach. And, locking people up and telling them off for being in a doorway absolutely is not the way to deliver. And it would be interesting, I don't know whether the police stats can measure that is that reduction in antisocial behaviour as a part of this. I guess with the pandemic and with lockdown, it's a bit difficult to differentiate the impact of that from the other. And then the other thing that just struck me, Jonathan, because Jonathan and I were in the same meeting earlier this week at the Health and Wellbeing Board, and talking about the health and wellbeing strategy for Worcestershire, which is going to be revised and to come out. And actually one of the key points of debate was whether mental health and well-being should be an overarching theme. And in what you said to us just now, you have absolutely illustrated that helping people with some of the practicalities, but they need, I wrote down the words emotional management, it might not quite be your words, they need a level of therapy, emotional stability and mental well-being before they can do the other stuff, which is really interesting. And I hope that gets reflected back into the strategy when we share the draft.
Can I make a comment? I think we all need that interdependence. My wife would say to me, I need her emotional stability. I think we all need it. And people experiencing homelessness are no different to any of us around this table. I think we often use the wrong word, independent living. I think I would argue that's not what we should be seeking. It should be an interdependence, because we all need, human beings are social beings. We all need somebody else. And I think you're absolutely right. I would say emotional regulation, soothing, is entirely at the root of calming people down to start to be able to engage those parts of their brain infrastructure, I guess, that can help them think. So I think you're right. Yeah.
Okay, Jabba Riaz.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Jonathan, I think on a previous occasion, you've mentioned to us that your aim is never to eliminate homelessness, but to, I think the words were reduced. Can I have a clarification on that point you made first before I move on? Is that...
Yes, so this is a personal perspective. I think we have to accept there has to be a level of tolerance of homelessness in its various forms, having a unifying purpose, which is that Worcestershire is a place where all forms of homelessness, including rough sleeping, is rare, is brief, and is non-recurring, is pragmatic. That clear?
Thank you for that clarification. And having thought about that, I think I have to kind of agree, because we're never going to get to that zero point. But clearly the work that you've been doing and the approach that you're taking is beginning to work. A couple of questions around it is, and is working. The question around it is, are the current figures that you're using through this model being skewed by the pandemic? Would it have been different at an earlier stage or post-pandemic? So are we lulled into a false sense of security by some of the figures that we've got? So that's one question. And the more of a reflection on the back of it is that the fact that we've constantly now shown as a city and as a city that we can deal with this homelessness problem through the multi-agency format that we've adopted, and that has been worked so well that we are beginning to become really, really good at it. And one of my ambitions, Chair, has been that if we're so good at it, that kind of displays some of the beauty of our city, that we're a city of love and of caring, of compassion, that through adopting innovative new models such as and ways of working like this, that we can become a centre of excellence.
Thank you. To answer your first question, I don't think it's been bent out of shape. The participants which were selected by the district councils had been on the books for some time. They were well known, they were difficult to house, and they were transferred to the service over early part and middle and late 2020. So I don't think it has bent out of shape. It's made it much more difficult for the case managers to undertake their work, because of course other services, abutting services such as drugs and alcohol and GP appointments became impossible to get access to. Methadone scripts, etc., became difficult to put into place. So the workers had their work cut out during the early part of last year's pandemic. And to take on your point about we're good at this, Worcester is a small city. We have a lot of good people to be able to do this work well. And I am encouraged, I hope you would also take a moment to examine the Centre for Homeless Impact, which has been set up now for about 3 years, I think by a former director of research from Crisis. And the Centre for Homeless Impact is a long overdue initiative. And what it effectively does for people like me, and I guess councillors and leaders, is to corral in one place the evidence about what services work and demonstrate how those services are over time evidence-based, so that when we start to invest in services and scrutinise how the public pound is being spent, elected members can be much more rigorous about saying, well, why are we spending money on this service when the evidence that it works is very limited, when we should be spending money on that service where the evidence is very strong. So the Centre for the Homeless Impact, I think, I hope will bring homeless charities to think about more carefully being an evidence-based, taking an evidence-based approach in terms of the deployment of services such as Housing First within the service mix. So have a look at their website. It's brilliant.
Okay, and any Tom Collins. Oh, sorry, Gavin.
Thank you, Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Just a follow-on point I think I picked up on earlier in terms of reduction in number of visits to the police station and cautions and that. So how do we link that then in terms of the model that you're approaching? How do we link it in with the police, with the justice system, with the promotion system? That's saying, hang on a second, we've identified this person, he's now entered into this program. How does that information then get fed through, and how will it relate to if there are then instances of them being in trouble with the law?
Yep. This is the nub of the evaluation by colleagues at the university. Indeed, tomorrow is our evaluation working group and partners from across police, criminal justice, ambulance, housing attend. And the essence of the challenge is to identify the data that they hold on their individual management systems for these individuals, doing so in a way that doesn't breach confidentiality and data protection, and then costing those interventions over time. There are a number of cost models. The Manchester University and Greater Manchester Authority have some cost models which say a trip to prison cost X, an ambulance trip costs Y. And what they're trying to do is to look at those costs for each participant over time and see the change. Other Housing First services have demonstrated that difference and have demonstrated the cost savings, or often demand savings, to other public services. So that's the essence of the evaluation. Tom.
Thanks, Chair. This is a slightly tangential question, I'm afraid, and I think I know the answer, but I'd love to hear your views as someone who's got real experience on the ground. But I mean, the pandemic's brought into even clearer visibility the fact that all is not well in many of our domestic situations, and we've seen an increase in domestic violence through the pandemic. We've seen increases in mental health problems. My question is, do you think the support services and the models of delivering those support services might actually have value beyond people who are homeless or threatened with homelessness, but people who are living under extreme pressure or have experienced previous trauma, who might just be stably homed, buried in our communities? And as an authority with responsibility for housing and community safety and quite a broad remit, are those benefits and even cost savings possible to be realised beyond the realm of homelessness?
Gosh, that's a question to answer. In all honesty, I'd have to think about that before I gave you an answer right now. You're putting me right on the spot. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer that without really thinking it through. It's a tough question to give you an answer on, and I wouldn't want to give you a silly answer or glib answer.
That's understood. Thank you very much.
Okay, any further comment or questions? Okay, the recommendation is that we note the contents of the report. Everyone happy to do so? Okay, Jonathan, as ever, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, councillors. It's nice to see you all with legs. It's nice to see you all. Thank you for listening, and have a nice evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 7, request for capital funding to support an MHCLG rough sleeper move on accommodation bid. Lloyd?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Chair, this is a report for decision, and it brings to you and members the recent invitation to bid along with registered providers of housing and the voluntary and charity sector for money from the rough sleeping accommodation programme, referred to in the report as RSAP, RSAP. The objective of this bid is to provide move-on homes available as long-term assets, along with accompanying support services to achieve a sustainable reduction in rough sleeping. So very much tied in with what Jonathan has just talked about, but that next step for rough sleepers away from Housing First and into a more settled home. The bid in total, or the pot in total, is 211 million, 140 million of that capital and 70 million of that revenue, and it's available over the remainder of the RSAP programme and seeks to deliver 2,700 additional units of accommodation. The majority of the capital funding is available in this year, and with a small amount available to deliver homes in next year as well. The submission for this bid, Chair, is the 2nd of September 21, and this report seeks a financial contribution for the submission of a bid that, if successful, would see us, in partnership with Citizen Housing, acquiring 8 self-contained properties that will provide the council with 100% nomination rights. And that's a really important point to make in respect of this report. It seemed a bit too good to be true in the first instance, so we double checked it and triple checked it, but it is right. It would give us 30 years nomination rights on 8 properties. And as I said, Chair, it's funding for capital and revenue-based accommodation schemes. So it's that support wraparound service for residents, as well as a roof over their heads. And that revenue support is available from 21-22 to 23-24, so for 3 years. Bids need to be co-produced with the ministry, Chair, and officers have been having conversations with them along with Citizen Housing, and the properties need to be completed for occupation by the 31st of March. So in respect of the bid, Chair, we went out to all our registered providers to seek their interest, and Citizen Housing were the organisation that confirmed their commitment to work up a bid, and that's been co-designed with colleagues from Citizen Housing. The proposal, as I say, is for the acquisition of up to 8 one-bed self-contained flats to be in place from 31st of March 22, which will see Citizen Housing deliver the housing management and repair element, and then we would separately commission a support provider through a council procurement process. Property prices of the type that we're seeking, Chair, vary between £80,000 to £140,000 in the city. And for this to stack up for Citizen, they are requiring a financial contribution of £60,000 to make the purchase and repair financially viable. And what we've been advised from Homes England is that their maximum contribution would be £45,000 to that contribution, which leaves a 15k shortfall. So in order to secure us the best chance of being successful, the proposal would see Citizen requesting £45,000 per unit from Homes England, and with us contributing £15,000 per unit in order to make up the £60,000 per unit subsidy. Citizen Housing will then obviously make up the difference between grant and purchase price to acquire the property and then repair it for the ongoing period. So subject to approval, Chair, we're asking members to allocate or recommend to Policy and Resources Committee for the allocation of £120,000 from the City Plan Fund Housing for Vulnerable Tenants, which was agreed previously by Council, and that currently is unspent. It still has £500,000 within that fund. The report is also seeking an allocation of £20,000 from this committee. I think it's probably prudent to work on the basis that these properties won't be furnished. So in order for us to get the properties furnished and ready to move into, an allocation of £20,000 is sought to be able to undertake that work. So £140,000 in total across the 8 units of accommodation. Just tying it in with some of the more sort of corporate principles, Chair, members will remember the approval and the endorsement from this committee for the council to increase the number of properties we have available to ourselves, the target being 62 properties. So another 8 would certainly work their way towards that. And again, just to reiterate, this will see the City Council have 100% nomination rights. So at the moment, Jonathan referred to it, there are some cases where we need to have a conversation with registered providers about, is this tenant suitable? With this gives the council 100% nomination rights. We are responsible. There's obviously impacts as well around housing benefit subsidy, and I think let's not underestimate. We will also be in control of our own destiny around the standard of accommodation that these individuals live in. Whereas at the moment, again, that can be a bit of a struggle for us. So the last point to make, Chair, really is just around the revenue impact. That will only see us through for 3 years. But previously at this committee, we've talked about some of the work that we need to do to ensure continuity of funding around this area of work. I've mentioned the integrated care system and the conversations that are going on with colleagues in health. Public health funding has been forthcoming in recent years, and I think there's a general direction of travel that the government will continue to support this area of work as well. So although a small risk, I'm fairly comfortable we will be able to continue that revenue support through and beyond 23-24 through a variety of other avenues of financial support. So I shall stop there, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Lloyd, thank you. I've got Tom Collins to begin with.
Yeah, thank you, Lloyd, and I appreciate the reassurances you've given us as you've worked through this. I apologise. Can you just help me understand the capital model a bit here? So we're putting in 140k. Are MHCLG covering the entirety of the rest of the cost of the properties, or are Citizen putting in some capital as well?
Thank you, Councillor Collins. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. I think if we work on the basis, Councillor Collins, that the cost range of these properties sits somewhere between £80,000 and £140,000. What Citizen have told us is that they need a contribution of £60,000 from wherever for that to stack up for them. So the proposal is that per unit, Homes England would if the bid is successful, would provide £45,000 per unit. The City Council would make a contribution of £15,000 per unit to meet that 60k subsidy. And then based on the cost range, that would see Citizen Housing making a contribution of, from a capital point of view, of anywhere between £20,000 up to £60,000.
Super, thank you.
Any further comment or questions? Mike Johnson.
Perhaps I've misunderstood, but the previous presentation to me suggested that rough sleepers was a get them off the streets, put them into an environment, and that's the environment they want to stay in. So can you explain to me what the move on bit of this is? Because to me, that suggests we put them here, we sort them out, and then we move them on. Well, that's not the model that we've just been presented with.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Yeah, so this is the next step on that journey, I suppose, is the best way for me to explain that. When a rough sleeper enters Housing First, they're at the sort of, the far end of the extreme, difficult to engage with, lots of support wrapped around them. And as Jonathan eloquently said, it's very much their choice where they go. Once they've progressed through that journey and they are ready to make the next step into a more, for want of a better word, a more settled home, a home that's more of their own, this would be the avenue for them. And what that does, that then releases Housing First back into play for other rough sleepers.
Sorry, that's not the impression I got. I got the impression of we are taking rough sleepers and putting them into a supported environment that they remain comfortable in and would wish to stay in. So all I can see is, so we now need to have some more accommodation, and we fill that, and then but you're suggesting that we're going to move these individuals in, provide support, and then they will move on, and that's not what I think is going to happen.
So again, yeah, apologies if I'm not explaining. So we won't, we don't put pressure on anybody to leave Housing First. This is very much, it's a sort of a co-produced model. But what we don't want is for people to spend years and years and years in Housing First. The aim is to move them on into more settled accommodation. So it's Housing First isn't a short-term thing, but it's certainly not a much longer-term project either. But when that person is ready to leave Housing First, is able to stand on their own 2 feet, needs a lower level of support, but may still need some support in order for us to release those Housing First properties back to people who are on that more entrenched end of the scale. This is what does that for us.
I've got Jim Carver, then Tom Collins, and I believe Jabba. Jim.
Thanks, Lloyd. Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, obviously, I read it as Housing First, really much sort of being in tandem with RSAP. Looking ahead at things, I'm obviously, Jabba spoke about the benchmark, which I think we're all very, very proud of across the political parties. What's been achieved here in Worcester is admirable. I'm wondering, sort of, because they're sort of so intertwined, I'm looking back at the previous item and the evaluation process, which has been awarded to University of Worcester, and I'm wondering whether we as a committee need to sort of be trying to get a gauge, and I know it's a very difficult thing to try and get a gauge on as we come out of the pandemic, but moving forward, because we are achieving such a benchmark, there may come a time where people in similar situations currently in other authorities, other areas, may actually look to Worcester positively to help them with their dilemmas. So if they do choose to do that, I'm wondering whether we should be approaching the evaluation process to see whether they could look at some sort of indication with regards to future funding when they think we may sort of hit that high peak, if indeed it does happen. But I'm pretty certain, as we do seem to be getting the results we're getting, it necessarily follows that people will want to take their, understandably, may want to take their chances with us in the city of Worcester. So is it something that could be looked at? Because obviously what we don't want to do is suddenly find we've created this dilemma, this finance dilemma for us, because what we've achieved is great. But if we can get some sort of evaluation process done on that, we could see actually if that is likely, and if necessary at a later point, the committee can sort of look at possible future funding. But in back of my mind, I think, I do think as we come out of the pandemic, we might find, certainly we know the mental health kickback that's come from the pandemic, and we may find actually that we're underestimating where we might be in, say, I don't know, 18 months, just putting a time slot out of the air. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, absolutely understand the point, Councillor Carver, and I can see the benefit. I suppose the pressure here is that we have an opportunity to bid for money by the 2nd of September, and for £120,000 contribution in effect, that will see the City Council have 8 more properties at their control to be able to place those residents who need to be placed in there. So I think it's the time pressure that prevents us from doing that, but I absolutely understand the point, and I suppose if we had more time, we would be able to look at that.
If it's sort of a working practice thing, is it something that can be looked at after the, once we've got to get through this important timescale to get the application in? Is it something that some thought could be given to, and perhaps we can come back and visit that at a future committee?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, Chair. We can certainly, it's trying to find the sort of peaks and troughs, isn't it, to sort of guide whether we go down this avenue again or not. So we can look at that, absolutely.
Yeah. Tom, then Jabba.
Thanks, James. I'm bouncing off Mike's point, really. My understanding, I know Housing First is a pilot at the moment. It's not our MO. But my understanding is the secret source of Housing First is that direct access and then the support services mapped to it. It's not particularly tied to the property, apart from that property should be full and sustainable accommodation. So can you help us understand what ties a property to being a Housing First property, and what ties a property to being a move-on property? And is there a way that we might create fluidity in that pool so that we're more flexible?
I probably don't have the level of detail, Councillor Collins, to answer your question in detail, but I would see the accommodation that we're talking about as part of this being very more sort of general needs, so capable of suiting a wide range of tenants or residents, as opposed to the Housing First being very much based on that person's needs and risks, I suppose.
Thank you. Jabba.
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose in a similar vein to Mike's question, and possibly what Councillor Collins is saying, I think there's an interesting question that kind of comes out of this. I absolutely understand the need of why we're doing this now at this current point and the opportunity for us not to lose out on that function. But there is a flow chart that we need to kind of work out of where they sit, and I think you've kind of clarified it in terms of what this specific accommodation is designed for in terms of that. So it's not the most in need stuff, but those that are at risk or have just recently gone into that system, go into this system. But what it does do is is there then a blockage in that system? Because if our original intention is for the housing first model to move on into this move on accommodation model, then if you can see that if both are occupied at the same time, then that blockage kind of does occur. So I think what we need to figure out is there are enough units in the system for us to cope with that demand. I think that's what I can take out of Councillor Johnson's questioning in this, and clarity over what type of accommodation is for what, so that we're not duplicating any services, and alternatively saying actually whether this money would have been spent better elsewhere. From the report, I absolutely agree in terms of what we're getting for that trumps that in this case, but it does create a dilemma going forward.
Thanks. I sort of see this as being somewhat counterproductive, if I'm perfectly honest. We need the housing, but I'm not entirely sure that the purpose of housing first is to have them in housing and then moving them on and then moving them on again. To me, this actually could trigger potential issues with the residents that are living in these properties. So I just wonder if there's a way of having the funding and maybe not using it as move on funding and using it to increase on number of housing first units, because that, we've heard tonight from Jonathan, in Worcester it works. We know pretty much across Europe and the US, where they've been running it for years, that it works. So why are we trying to now add an extra layer into it? Housing first is about providing that housing. That housing is supposed to be long-term housing. It's not supposed to be a sort of interim stopgap to then move somebody on to something else. So I'm struggling with this because of that, because I think that this is going to end up being quite counterproductive and will set us back a step or two.
So just for clarity, Chair, just so all members are aware, we aren't intending on moving anybody out of housing first. When somebody is ready to move out of housing first, they'll be ready to move out of housing first. So we are not going to evict anybody. We are not going to force anybody out. Housing first is their home. And we will support them to make the next step whenever they're ready. I've probably overplayed the housing first element, but this scheme is very much based on rough sleepers. And what we need to do, because we've only got X number of housing first properties, we do need to see a churn. We do need to see people progress and step back into real life. But you're right, Councillor Griffiths, the reality is that the scheme has enough fluidity and flexibility in it that as long as we are housing people who are vulnerable, have suffered some sort of homelessness or rough sleeping, then it will all stack up, if that makes sense.
Tom and then Jim again.
Thanks. I'll try. Hopefully, these are closing remarks from me. But yeah, I think I understand then, Lloyd. I think probably in light of the excellent presentation we heard from Jonathan, this clearly being move on is not helpful for us. But I understand that the move on is the hangover from our existing standard model until we fully adopt housing first. And actually, what I see here is you've spotted an opportunity to acquire 8 units in the context of a situation where we're desperate for more accommodation and in an incredibly capital efficient way. And you're trying to respond quickly and rapidly and in an agile way to acquire that successfully. So, overall, I think, unless you tell me I'm wrong, I get it. And I want to say, great idea and well done.
Jim Carver.
Yeah, I just really wanted to sort of say the way I'm looking at this is obviously this is important because RSAP actually allows housing first to develop, and without having RSAP, my concern is that with clients settled with Housing First, we could find a situation where there's a blockage at the Housing First end. And there will come a point with the clients Housing First who will be, you know, who will be ready to take that step. I don't think it's, I would say to colleagues, I don't think we should be concerned about Housing First or saying, right, let's quickly pass this on to RSAP. You know, these are clients with extreme difficulties who are being looked after by professionals, and in that they would not want to undo all the good work that they have done until they feel that their clients are ready to take that next step. So I actually see them running in tandem. So I would hope, if I could, you know, as an observation, I would hope clients would, hope colleagues would say, wouldn't see these two as two opponents. They're both ships sailing in the same direction, and maybe one's ready to sort of help one of the other ships, you know, when it reaches a certain point, but only when it reaches that point. And I think the concern from members of the committee would be that maybe some reassurance is needed that of the Housing First clients aren't being pushed or aren't being forced to run before they can walk.
Any further comment? Good, thank you. Essentially, to go through the recommendation, then we've got 1.1, which is the noting of the report. Can I get a sense that we're happy to do that? Okay. 1.2 and 1.3 will obviously require a show of hands in this instance. 1.2 is the recommendation to Policy and Resources, an allocation of up to £120,000. Lloyd just explained that. Jim, did you want to? I'm sorry, yeah. So can we just deal with 1.2 and would you indicate your approval of that, please, by show of hands?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. 1.3 is subject to the above being approved by Policy and Resources, an allocation of a further £20,000 from the Vulnerable Adults Accommodation City Plan Fund to furnish the properties. Would you again indicate your approval or otherwise, please?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Okay, that's item 7 done. Item 8 is the Q1 performance report, and I pass to Lloyd again, please.
Thank you, Chair. Warwick may want to come up as well, Chair, just in case there are any questions. Chair, this is the Q1 performance report for 21-22. So members will see a new set of KPIs and projects that were approved by this committee back in spring of this year. Chair, just to note that in terms of the projects, there's a fair smattering of green. Some of those are linked to moves to the timescale, so members will have probably picked up on that. But the colours are good, and same for some of the key performance indicators, Chair. So I don't intend to go through any of them in any great detail, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Questions, please. Tom, Matt, and then, yeah, in that order. Tom, please.
Just the one from me. I think possibly the deliberations of this committee have been misrepresented in recent discussions around free tennis. My strong recollection of the consensus of this group was that free tennis should mean kind of barrier-free access to those tennis facilities for people for a certain period of availability. So those tennis courts were really easily accessible for anybody to use. And that was part of that whole remit. The whole funding model was to encourage uptake of tennis from people who are not enthusiasts, who are not regular users of courts, who would not otherwise be doing it. What I think we've seen delivered so far has been a system with a lot of barriers. There are a limited number of free sessions, but I'm not going to contend the quantity right now. What I will contend is that for people to access those free sessions, they have to meet some criteria. I don't remember us ever discussing that. And in particular, they have to evidence those criteria. Many of those criteria are demonstrating a low income or a vulnerable situation. And I don't like that for people to access our free and available tennis, to get into tennis and take it up, involves someone having to go and prove to another person that they're on a low income with some kind of documentation. So can we address the way this free tennis is delivered by Freedom And just can the committee receive some reassurances in the near future that that is now a much less barriered process for users?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Noted Councillor Collins's points. I suppose just a couple of things. We have increased in the last couple of months the provision of free tennis, so additional hours at less antisocial hours, if that makes sense, more opportune hours. But I do take the point around the perceived barriers to accessing tennis. Like a lot of council services, concession services, we ask for proof of benefits or whatever it may be. So I don't think we're out of keeping with some of the other concessions we provide. Albeit I do take the point, we need to make it as easy as possible for people. I'm sure members are not condoning that we just leave courts open for free access, because there's a balance there around security of courts and damage. But Chair, if you're at your blessing, we can go away, look at that further and bring something back to Chair and Vice Chair first of all for conversation.
Yes, thanks very much. As I think I said during the council meeting a couple of weeks ago, I'm happy to work with Councillor Riaz and officers to re-examine reasonably, I think would be the way I'd put it at this point. If you're happy with that point, we may need to take it up again at AOB, but at this point, that's what I'm prepared to do.
Super, thank you, James.
Okay, thank you. Griffiths.
I did approach the chair before the meeting under any other business to raise the issue of free tennis. And the reason for this is on behalf, not only of myself, but also on behalf of my colleague, Councillor Udall, who did ask this question in the last full council. And his follow-up question was about, because of what he felt and what I feel was the underutilisation of those courts. Nobody's criticising the courts. I don't want anyone to interpret this as a criticism of those courts. They're great courts. I used to play on them previously, and they're a great improvement now. But as Richard pointed out in full council, that they are being underutilised at the moment. And Councillor Udall did raise the issue of whether they could be used for free tennis, especially for the children over the summer, which was one of the reasons why I wanted to raise this as an important issue, because we're already into the end of July, and I think this is something that needs to be addressed before the next meeting of the Communities Committee, because by the time we meet again, the summer will be gone and the kids will be back at school. So I think it was an urgent issue about looking about whether some free tennis could be provided for children, especially over the summer, to utilise that spare capacity. And I think that would fit in with the work done by Councillor Griffiths and the Health and Wellbeing Committee, with its emphasis on health, and obviously our council's responsibility to provide and encourage healthy sporting activities. But I also think it should be followed, as Councillor Collins has said, with a broader review of the availability, accessibility and take up of free tennis, because we don't want to put any excessive barriers to put people off actually accessing this wonderful new resource that we've got in the city.
To reiterate, I guess, I'm perfectly prepared to work with officers, and I suspect Jabarias will want to be part of that process. Understanding that we are not, we're some distance away from the next Communities Committee meeting, and briefings that will take place between now and then. We can expedite that process, I suspect, to some degree. Whilst I'm not going to make promises at committee this evening, we want to approach this in a reasonable way, and I'll have conversations with Councillor Riaz and officers in the coming days. Matt.
That was a question that came from what Councillor Collins. My original question is referring to page 39 on the data, and it's about housing. We've spoken a lot about housing today, and obviously it's an incredibly important issue. And anyone who's been to the South Worcestershire Development Plan briefings that have happened over the last few weeks, I think I know we've been told this many times, but I think it's astonishing how many new houses are going to be built in the local area. And when you go on these staycations, wherever you go in this country, there seems to be building houses everywhere. And it's quite sobering, and it reminds one of one's own mortality when in the South Worcestershire Development Plan briefing the other day, they started talking about tranches of houses that will be built after 2040, when I'll be 70. So that may be very old, that they were already thinking when I will be retired. But the point about the data on page 39 is it's not just building houses. You know, that's not just the issue. It's houses, the right kind of houses, and building houses that are accessible to the widest number of people. And I think there was something in the news this week that the average house price in the UK, and I know it's skewed by places like London, has reached something like £330,000. And any relationship there used to be between average wages and the affordability of an average sized house is completely broken now. And when you actually look at the target set by the council for, you know, 100 affordable houses. Now, when you actually look at it, you know, we've got a target of 100 affordable houses completed this year. If you go back to 2013, which is almost best part of a decade ago, there were 80 then. Now, it's gone up marginally, but an increase from 80 to 100 is not a huge amount. And I wonder whether this target is ambitious or stretching enough. And perhaps this is the right place to sort of change this as a policy. But it really brought it home to me when I went to that South Worcestershire Development Plan briefing. These amazing houses, but nobody can afford the things. You know, I think who's going to be living in these 4 or 5 bedroom executive houses? I couldn't afford that, and I'm principal of a college. You know, I'm not being funny. You know, so I think, you know, is this target 100? Is it ambitious and stretching enough, really?
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think the target is reflective of where we've been as an authority over the last decade or so. I think it's also reflective of some of the challenges a small city with not much land availability provides, and the difficulty in getting sort of brownfield sites away. Two positive things I'll add, Chair. I am hopeful of bringing a Worcestershire-wide housing strategy to this committee in November for members to approve. And Councillor Lamb, there's a real thrust in there around proper affordable housing, housing for social rent, because we know in this city that demand is exceeding supply, you know, by X factor. The other piece of work members will be aware they approved, but COVID has slowed that down, unfortunately, is the piece of work around housing and enabling. So we are very close to commissioning a piece of work that will bring a housing specialist in and guide us and support us in modernising how we play our housing enabling role. So how do we work better with Homes England? How do we work better with housing providers and other providers of housing to really revitalise and refresh how we approach housing development in the city, whether that be homes to social rent, affordable or general market housing. So I suppose the answer is watch your space.
Louise Griffiths.
Thanks. I'm also going to mention tennis. Sorry. I play tennis, and I think it's great that we're offering free provision. We need to offer way more free provision for tennis. I think that's nobody's going to argue with that. I wonder if it might be possible, if we're going to try and do it in a quick time frame, to incorporate it in with some of the summer activities that are being led by Worcester Community Trust this summer. I know Lynn and I were in a meeting with them a few weeks ago. They were talking about the activities programs that they're doing this summer. I think, you know, particularly in Cripplegate Park, it would be a really good opportunity to do some work with WCT around providing extra tennis sessions there for children. But one thing I did want to ask was, and this might have slipped me by when this came before us a couple of years ago, was for these free tennis sessions, is there equipment provided for the children, or are they well, whoever's using it, or are they expected to have their own? Because I would imagine that equipment is a really sizable barrier. I mean, you know, I have an expensive tennis racket, but you can pick them up fairly cheap. But what is cheap for me is most probably highly unaffordable for somebody who is living below the poverty line. And, you know, so there's at least 2 tennis rackets plus balls. Is that being provided by Freedom Leisure, or is it not? And if not, why not? And how much of a barrier is that to people accessing these free tennis courts?
Okay, can I defer to Warwick on that one?
Thanks, Louise. So as I understand it, the coaching, they provide all the equipment, but if you were like a member buying a session or a rate or a membership, the insurance would, you have your own kits to be able to play.
Thank you. And then the second point that I wanted to ask was, is it possible to have an update on some of the child poverty test and finish stuff? Because it's all detailed in here, but there's no real update on it. And a lot of it obviously involves health and wellbeing strategy and working with the health and wellbeing board at county. So my query is, those actions in particular from the child poverty task and finish group report, are they staying with this committee, or are they going to come to the health and wellbeing committee? Because it seems to me that they should probably sit within health and wellbeing, as they do involve the health and wellbeing strategy and the health and wellbeing board at county.
Chair, where there's a future discussion to discuss the responsibility for that item, but at the moment on the forward plan, there is a child poverty update report coming back to this committee in November.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike Johnson, then I believe Tom again, but and Jabba. Mike.
I'd just like to go back to the affordable housing discussion. Isn't our problem that this indicator talks about what's been built and completed, which implies within the city? Isn't the real question, what's the extent of allocations we've got within the urban extensions, which, as I understand, there's an accord that gives us right of access to affordable housing outside the city, and that would be a far better indicator, I would suggest.
I can take that one away and discuss with housing colleagues, Chair. But yeah, it's a fair point, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks. There's a quick one on the same topic that Councillor Johnson and Councillor Lambert brought up. Lloyd, can you just clarify for me? Is it our policy that we only procure properties inside the administrative boundary of the city? Or are we as a council willing to procure properties in all these urban extension areas outside of our administrative boundary?
Can you clarify for what purpose, Councillor Collins, in terms of acquisition of property?
I guess under the same topic that Matt raised, this for these affordable housing. No, that's completion of affordable housing. That's a good point. No, I mean, for example, for the move on housing we were just discussing a minute ago.
So I don't think there's anything legally that prevents us from doing that. I think our preference is to have it within the city and invest in the city. But there's also guidance from SIPFA that's sort of pointing local authorities away from investing outside of city areas. So I wouldn't say we're actively pursuing properties outside of our area at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, I have to work with you on tennis. I want to declare an interest. I recently purchased a Freedom tennis pass and have participated in tennis at there. And have invited Councillor Udall to a tennis match as well. So just waiting for the invite. And there is a solution. I think a quick solution. There is a quick solution. And there is, I think, there is a quick solution that we can work on together on that in terms of that. I mean, so happy to work with you on that.
I'm totally 100% with you, but obviously all actions have consequences, and we can't anticipate what those will be unless we discuss it sensibly in a certain process. Is that okay?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make 2 points, one about tennis and one about housing. Lloyd said when he was talking at the beginning that our policy of asking people to show that they are entitled to have free tennis sessions was in line with what we do in other situations. It'd be interesting to know what those other situations are and whether there are also things that ought to be reported on. But do we provide any other sports, for example?
So the one that springs to mind that taking a lot of my time at the moment, Chair, is allotments. So whether you're accessing a reduced rate based on age or for any other reason, officers will seek some form of evidence to support that.
Okay. And about housing, the term affordable housing, I believe covers several different categories, and it might be useful if you defined what exactly this one is looking at. Is it social housing, or is it housing that's, I don't know what the current definition is, but something like 60% of average rents or something like that?
Yeah, you're correct, Councillor. It will cover homes of social rent. It will cover affordable housing and shared housing. So we can make that clear in the narrative if you wish.
Okay. Yes, probably.
Sorry, what was that?
Well, could it be unbundled? Could we have? I mean, this might be the wrong time to ask, but I think it'd be useful to divide this one up into two: social housing and affordable housing, for example.
So I think what we can do, Chair, is in the narrative we can split out the numbers by type. So we can say X number of homes for social rent, X number of shared homes, X number of homes for affordable housing. So we can definitely make that clear in the narrative.
Thank you.
And Jack.
Yes, through you, Chair. I think one of the other services Nigel Bissett was asking in terms of reduced rate was swimming, and also we do free swimming. I remember when I was chair of that committee, we introduced free swimming for those that couldn't swim less than 25 meters as well. So that's available.
Any further comment? Tom?
Yeah, just that was be the last for me, I promise. Just to say, we've had a heck of a year and there's a lot of green ticks, so well done.
Okay. Believe that's concluded that item on the agenda. I had one item of AOB, but Matt, are you happy to proceed as we've discussed? Yes. I don't have any other items of business, so at that moment, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and see you again soon. Thanks very much.